All right, we've got a few people coming in. Hello, and thank you to everyone joining us tonight for our event with Bill Hayes and Bonnie Tsui. We are celebrating the release of Bill Hayes' latest book, Sweat, A History of Exercise. And just before we get started, I want to let you all know about a few upcoming events we have here at Green Apple. This Thursday, the 27th, Etsu O'Reilly will be in store for a reading of his latest poetry collection entitled Herd Horde at 7 p.m. And on Tuesday, February 1st, Leslie Kirk Campbell will be here to celebrate her new story collection, The Man with Eight Legs, in conversation with Nona Kaspers, also at 7 p.m. Please note that to attend our in-person events, you will need to wear a mask and present proof of vaccination. For more info, you can find our event calendar at greenapplebooks.com/event. And audience members, for this evening, feel free to leave your questions and comments in the chat or Q&A box, and our wonderful authors will answer them at the end of the hour. And now I'd like to introduce our featured authors for this evening. Bonnie Tsui was born in Queens, New York, and raised on Long Island. As her parents met in a swimming pool in Hong Kong, it seemed fitting that she and her brother should then prepare for competitive swimming careers, which lasted a decade. Bonnie lives, swims, and surfs in the Bay Area and is a member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto. Her new book, Why We Swim, was published by Algonquin Books in April 2020. And Bill Hayes is the author of How We Live Now, Insomniac City, The Anatomist, and How New York Breaks Your Heart, among other books. Hayes is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction and a frequent contributor to the New York Times. He has completed the screenplay for a film adaptation of Insomniac City, currently in the works from Hopscotch Features, and he is also a co-editor of Oliver Sacks' posthumous books. He lives in New York, and you can visit his website at billhayes.com. And with that, enjoy the reading, everyone. Over to you, Bonnie.
Thanks, Erica. Thank you, Green Apple, for hosting us. I'm really excited to be talking with Bill about sweat. And just a reminder to any questions that come up, please pop them in the chat box and we will get to them in the Q&A a little bit later. So Bill, I love that this book starts with a cold plunge in a lake. And as you know, I am very partial to swimming. But I do love, of course, that there's this wonderful sensory and sensual entry into the book, this description of what it means to break the surface. And I feel like this kind of crashing through with your body and the cracking and the body and all of its parts. I think you say something like it's the skin, muscles, bones, nerves entering the water. And I think that this feeling, the pleasure, the absolute pleasure of moving our bodies, it really evokes that in the temperature and the water and the force and the light. And I think that this is the animating force of your investigation into the history of moving our bodies. And it feels so perfect that is the start of this book. And, obviously a cold water plunge isn't something that is as delightful to other people as it is to us. And in fact, it may sound horrible to a lot of people, but I think we all know something, there's something very transformative about, a plunge into water or like a crashing through the woods on a trail run. Just, this transformative ability of exercise to work its magic on your body and your mind. And I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about how that feeling animates your investigation into this, the history of exercise.
Yeah, well, great to be here. First of all, thank you so much to Green Apple and to you, Bonnie. I spent a lot of years working on this book, about 10 years from start to finish, although there was a period of time where I didn't work on it at all and worked on these other books like Insomniac City. But I did do a tremendous amount of research. I got a Guggenheim grant and traveled throughout Italy and Europe and India, the US. But I also felt like I wanted for the reader to experience what exercise is like, and from my very personal perspective, and that it should be sort of give that sense of how sensual it is, and And it's also just opening the book that way with a plunge into a very cold mountain lake. It was about 50 or 55 degrees. It was an October day and in the Adirondacks in New York. I was at an artist retreat, actually, set on a lake, beautiful lake. And I just couldn't resist. It was a beautiful fall day. The trees were, turning yellow and orange and brown. And I just thought, oh, what would it be like? What would it be like? And also, just because I've always loved to swim. And so I pushed myself off the dock and just plunged in. So it's also plunging the reader into the world of the history of exercise and plunging you into my mindset as I worked on this book.
Mm-hmm. In the course of your early research, you jot down what different notable people did for exercise, which I just love this part. So Freud being really into long walks in the mountains, Einstein and Tolstoy and Marie Curie bicycling, Kafka wrestling.
Right.
And I also really like that it didn't always match up with what you would have pictured for them. And I think there's something really great about talking about exercise as personality, right? So, or revealing of some, personality or character trait. And I wondered what kinds of character traits do you attribute to different forms or practices? Because that's kind of fun. You think of, why did you resist, thinking of Kafka as a wrestler, or why did it seem right that certain people were doing certain things? And, I just kind of like how we make certain judgments or observations based on that.
It's really true. And it was fun to sort of stumble upon those things in my reading, not even really necessarily doing research for this book, but reading a biography of Freud and finding that he loved to take long mountain walks. It just fit somehow. Could imagine that, leaving the psychoanalysis room and taking long mountain walks. Kafka, that really surprised me. It was in his diaries, that the diaries of Franz Kafka, that he says every night his next door neighbor, otherwise a complete stranger, would
I love that.
So odd, would, I guess, knock on the door, maybe just let himself in, and then they would wrestle for 10 or 15 minutes and really go at it. And then he would get up and walk out and go back to his room. But you're right. I mean, I think the form of exercise you choose does say something about your personality and your life, and it can change over time. I mean, that certainly is chronicled in my book, which is an interweaving of history going from antiquity up to the present day, up to the pandemic, but also my own life. So I sort of chronicle my history of exercise from boyhood. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the only son of a military father, who was very athletic, and he was a great swimmer himself. He swam on the swim team at West Point, taught us all how to swim, of course, and snow ski and water ski. So I did all those kind of Northwest sports. I got very into weightlifting, probably in my 20s and 30s, but also experienced the injuries of weightlifting, of overdoing it. Something that Plato could have warned me about back in 4th or 5th century BC. Plato having been a competitive wrestler himself, I learned. And then later in life, I'm 61 now. I still lift, but it's not as important to me. It feels good, but I'm certainly not going to get any bigger, any more muscular. And I really fell back in love with swimming, which has become a part of my practice, a part of my life. I swim at least 2 or 3 times a week, try to do a mile each time. And I really love it. And before the pandemic, I did a pretty regular yoga practice at my gym. And now less of that because of the pandemic, but I still do that with stretching. But I think there's a way in which exercise reflects where you are in your own life too.
Yeah, for sure. I also like how, I mean, for me, swimming is something that was, I mean, like it sort of mirrors the what you described, where you started with it, you know, it kind of ebbs and flows over your course of your exercise life. But what I find from talking to so many people is that swimming is one of those really great longevity sports, you know, that you can do that for your whole life and do it well until later life. Whereas something like, you know, something that's so hard on your joints, like lifting,
running.
yeah, right. I don't know. Sometimes people surprise you.
Yeah, that's true.
Surprise me with how they run into such later life and don't have injuries. But I think those are the rare, you know, somehow they're built for that, to withstand that that
impact.
It's just the constant grind. And I think that and yet there's I love to think about, you know, let's say you were a weightlifter for this particular period of your life, and then your body changed in this way, and then you did, you know, yoga, and then you did you know, back to swimming, and just that you also have a different relationship with your body in those.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the pandemic definitely changed my exercise regimen. The gym's closed for a time, of course. Had to adapt and do my own home exercise routine. But also I really appreciated walking in a way that I hadn't before. I've always been a walker. I'm a New Yorker, so we walk a lot, but I would think of walking more as transportation, really, like getting from A to B.
Right.
But because I live alone here, I needed and wanted to get out of the apartment during those early lockdown days, and would take long, brisk walks, and really, really appreciate that, and realize how much I took even the very act of walking for granted. So it was really interesting working on the book to also kind of dissect the dynamics of human movement, what it takes to walk or to run or to swim or to box or whatever.
Right. What it takes from you to do it, but also what it returns to you, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely,
in the form of bruises or mental or otherwise. But yeah, you know, I find that really fascinating. You write early on in this book that the sort of more recent history of exercise, you know, the trends, the fads, the CrossFits, the Pilates, the Pelotons, didn't interest you as much as I think you called it deep history, the deep history behind that, before that, and how you wanted to connect your own experience with that deep history and kind of use it to illuminate, you know, meaning of sort of your own practice. And so you spend a lot of time with this, for instance, with this 16th century work called De Arte Gymnastica, which was written by a well-known Italian physician at the time, who kind of revived the, you know, classical Greco-Roman emphasis on exercise and its relationship to health. And but you know, this isn't something that I would say your average exercise practitioner would know about this text. So for those who aren't familiar with this text, can you explain its significance and why it captured your imagination so strongly?
Sure. You know, you're absolutely right. I really wanted to learn about and write about things that I didn't know. So deliberately didn't write about CrossFit or SoulCycle or recent fads and trends, but really wanted to dig deep. So I first got this idea about 10 years ago, appropriately enough, at a gym. I was literally on a Stairmaster, mounted a Stairmaster, punched in my program, put down my towel and my water. And for some reason on that day, I just paused and looked out at the floor, people lifting weights, doing pull-ups, chin-ups on Bosu balls, doing yoga. And I just thought, how did we all end up here in gyms? And if I were to trace a line backward in time, how far would I go? Where would I land? So I began my research, but really with some of the more obvious people in the history of medicine and science: Hippocrates, Galen, Plato, others. And it was a librarian at a wonderful rare books room here in New York, the New York Academy of Medicine. And I had reserved these books, and she said, well, surely you know about Girolamo Mercuriale.
As
I
we all
said,
do.
as one does. And I said, no, I've never heard of him. Who is he? And she said, just wait here one moment. And she left, and she came back wearing white gloves and holding a pristine first edition of a book from 1569 called Dell'arte Gymnastica by Girolamo Mercuriale. And I had to put on white gloves myself and opened it up, and happened to open it up to a page that had an engraving or illustration of two wrestlers wrestling. It's like Kafka and his next door neighbor.
And his neighbor.
Yeah. And it was just so captivating. I swear at that moment when I saw that illustration, I just thought, what is this book? And it was a very thick book about exercise. But when I turned the page, was kind of disappointed to find it was entirely written in medieval Latin, which I could not read at all, though I did recognize the word exercise in the text. So I began a search to find an English translation of Mercuriale's book from 1569. That took a while, and I even tracked down the translator himself. And it set me off on a kind of journey to retrace Mercuriale's footsteps and how he came to write this book. Dell'arte Gymnastica is considered the first comprehensive book on exercise, certainly the first illustrated book on exercise. And it's fascinating because he writes about exercise purely from a physician's perspective and takes every form of exercise known at that time, walking, running, swimming, boxing, wrestling, and even forms of movement that we might not consider exercise, like laughter and crying, and considers them sort of ways, the pros and cons, and how they might benefit one's health or not. And drawing upon the writing and thinking of the ancients for the most part, Hippocrates, Galen, Plato, others. He, as I said, was a physician. He was a physician to a very prominent cardinal in Rome, prominent and wealthy Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. So Mercuriale had access to the Vatican Library and the Farnese family library, and he was able to decipher and read and draw upon all these ancient texts. So his aim was really to revive the ancient Greek art of exercise. And it was a fascinating book, went through several editions in his lifetime. But then it kind of got lost to history, as did Mercuriale himself. I think he thought he might be the Hippocrates of his day, of the Renaissance, but that did not turn out to be the case. He was pretty much unknown, except to academics and certain people like that. So the book also traces Mercuriale's own journey.
How did the book change the way you exercise?
Well, it made me really consider, think about, and try to articulate what it feels like to exercise in different ways. So talking about the plunge in the cold lake is a great example. I just almost wanted to provide like slowing down film footage and describing every moment, every sense, temperature, light, taste, smell, everything. I think it made me appreciate exercise even more. It also pushed me to try things I had not tried before, like boxing, and to try different forms of yoga, really just to experience them and feel like I could write about them from a really informed perspective.
What do you remember from your boxing experience the most? I think that since most of us probably haven't boxed, I think that that's an interesting.
Well, it's very appropriate that we're having this talk from Green Apple Books in San Francisco. I used to live in San Francisco. I lived there for 25 years, and there was a boxing gym that I used to walk by on Polk Street. I don't know if it's still there. And I was always kind of tempted to go in and see about classes, learning how to box. And I did so, and found out that they were starting a boxing boot camp like 3 days later. I went in on a Friday and they said, well, there's a boxing boot camp starting on Monday. It's 6 weeks, 6 days a week, starting at 6 a.m. And I knew it was going to be tough as hell, but one of my greatest accomplishments is that I did make it until the end. It was not just a kind of group fitness, cardio, kickboxing kind of class, which I had done,
Right.
I suppose. It was real boxing, and getting in the ring. And we wore padding and guards, but I went into it sort of thinking, I'll be pretty good at this, and it'll be kind of a kick to hit. But what I didn't really properly think about is that getting to hit also meant I was going to get hit back. And I turned out to be really good at that. Not so good at defending myself. And yeah, really got the experience of being punched in the face and knocked down, which was very much a part of exercise and athletics during antiquity. So I felt like I got a little bit of a taste of what that was like. Certainly incredibly strenuous to be in the ring with one other person. There were both men and women, but I was always with men, and tried to duke it out for just 2 or 3 minutes. Drenched in sweat and sometimes a little blood.
One of my dad's favorite stories about my brother and me is, so he was a black belt in karate. He was a brown belt in taekwondo. He was very schooled in boxing and other martial arts. And he raised us from very young to box each other. And one of his favorite stories, I mean, we would be, 5, 6 years old in the garage hitting each other. And one of his favorite stories is that his mom came to visit from San Francisco, and she came in and he said, look, I want to show you something, as a demo of my brother and me, like just going at it. But because we were terrible at defending ourselves, we just hit each other in this barrage of blows and then started crying. And she said, what are you doing, to my dad? And my dad said, they're supposed to defend themselves. I don't know what they're doing. So all this is to say is that this very basic human, like,
I know.
I love to hit, but I don't like being hit, it's just like goes way back to our very instinctive.
Yeah, I mean, the instinct is to flee, the instinct is to leave the scene, to get out of there. But there became something almost philosophical about it too, about having to stay in the moment, stay in the fight, literally, but also just stay in the moment, stay in your body, find your courage along with your breath.
Right. And control that.
Control. And there was also a kind of beauty in the art of boxing and the choreography involved. And the coaches were, very strict about form and the form that you took. I love that. I loved when I really began swimming seriously again. I got a swim coach so I could, improve my strokes. And I tell people who yearn to swim or say they used to swim and they would like to get back in the pool, take some lessons. Get a coach.
For sure.
Plenty of adults at the pool where I swim are learning how to swim, maybe for the first time, or maybe just to improve their strokes. Oh, it helps so much. It really helps you enjoy it more.
And it's I think it's a wonderful experience to be coached as an adult. I mean, I think that a lot of us have had that experience in our younger years, but that to remember that now you can still learn under the tutelage of someone who knows what they're talking about, and you can get better. And I think there's this satisfaction in that is I absolutely
it makes me think of yoga too, where it's maybe not individual coaching, but if you're in a group yoga class with a really good yoga teacher,
right,
and you stick with it, and you can, little by little improve your technique. And one day you can finally do crow pose, or
Uh-huh.
that pose that, has been so challenging for so long. That's really satisfying, whatever your age is.
For sure. Okay, so since this is a book about exercise, I think
Yes.
our audience would love to hear you read a passage in which you're actually exercising. And the one I think that we had in mind was the beginning of the chapter called On the Nature of Running. And I think it gives a nice
Yes.
sense of the things that we've been talking about.
This is On the Nature of Running, and I'm going to start with a quote from Hippocrates around the 400 BC. And he said, "Eating alone will not keep a man well. He must also take exercise. Those who get exhausted with running should wrestle, and those who get exhausted with wrestling should run." Back in New York, what comes to mind as I go for a run is one of my favorite lines from Mercuriale: "Running is supreme." Of course it is. I make this my mantra. Running is supreme, I think, as I wait for a light to change green in front of my building. Running is supreme as I dodge cars and dogs on leashes and bicyclists on the sidewalk. Running is supreme as I reach the Hudson and head down the west side of Manhattan on a smoothly paved path. What made running supreme in Mercuriale's mind was not only that it met the definition for exercise he carefully laid out in his book, but that it is, quote, granted to all. Anyone is capable of doing it, man, woman, child. One doesn't need a gymnasium. One doesn't need equipment or an opponent. One needs only healthy lungs and a pair of reasonably strong legs. I'm acutely conscious of mine as they run, how they do this automatically. But I also find myself enjoying willing them to do what I like, as if I were driving a car. I take a right and run to the end of a pier. I run backward, then forward, then steer back to where I began. I never look down. Each of my feet will touch the ground 1,000 times at least, perhaps twice that, for every mile I cover, while absorbing 3 times my body weight. I pick up my pace. I spot someone running more slowly than me and deliberately overtake him. It feels good to feel fast. This is my own private version of endurance running, which some evolutionary biologists argue may explain how we came to run in the first place.
Thanks, Bill. I think there's this feeling you capture in those 2 pages that, but that is essential to exercise. We talked about it earlier, that it feels good, right? That's very basic.
It feels good.
Yeah, it's about pleasure. It's about pleasure and movement. It feels good when you pass someone, and it doesn't feel that good when they pass you. But it's motivation too. And there's another passage that I'd like to ask you to read that I think is a pretty great juxtaposition against this one. And it has to do with you running into Alice Waters in Rome.
Oh yeah.
Not running into her, bumping into her, maybe. I think it's a pretty funny passage because, she's a queen of food and a certain kind of eating and living. And at first she sort of resists the purpose there, which is to research this book about exercise. But then it becomes clear after, a little bit, what you're after, and that you're after the same thing. So would you read to us from that chapter? I think is there.
This is from a chapter. Very good. Esercizio a Roma. This is when I was in Rome. I was retracing Mercuriale's footsteps when he was in Rome. And I was in residence at the American Academy in Rome, which is a really amazing, amazing place. And Alice Waters, the great chef, happened to be there. So this is at the American Academy. That night, during the old-fashioned cocktail hour that precedes dinner in the formal dining room, a time to mingle and socialize over a Negroni, I literally bumped into Alice Waters, the legendary founding chef of Berkeley's Chez Panisse. She was in residence for a few weeks as part of her long-standing involvement with the Rome Sustainable Food Project, founded under her guidance in 2007. We had met a few times before, years earlier, when I lived in the Bay Area. After I told her what I was working on here in Rome, Alice looked puzzled, bothered even. She had thought exercise was purely a modern construct, and she didn't look at all happy to hear me explain that gyms actually existed thousands of years ago, including here in Rome. To her mind, gyms were terrible places. Gyms are the fast food of exercise, she declared. How unpleasant it is, she observed, that people think they must go to a gym to exercise. Nothing comes of it. Nothing is produced as a result. People have lost the association between exercise and manual work, exercise and nature. Alice's instantaneous passion on the topic was as unexpected as it was invigorating. Every morning, she said, I wake up at 7 o'clock and I go out the door and I walk for 45 minutes. Wherever I am, however I am feeling, I don't see what the weather is like, I just walk. And it gives me time to think through my day. And then I return and I get organized for work. I always learn something, she said. She added that she would love to see what she has done with food at her Berkeley restaurant in Rome and beyond, translated into a philosophy of exercise, incorporated into one's day naturally, pleasurably, without effort, without artifice, without extravagance, without, she didn't use this word, and I hesitated to tell her the title of my book, but without sweat. It's the difference between going to a gym and dancing, she said. One is work, the other is pleasurable. Perhaps it is this word exercise that is so daunting. In my life, it has always been part of my work, carrying boxes up from the basement to the restaurant, sweeping the steps, going up and down the stairs, not thinking about it as this other thing, this separate thing, a place one has to go. I thought about how exercise supposedly disappeared during the Middle Ages and how this was not exactly true. Exercise did not go extinct or die. It was simply not separated out, promoted so self-consciously as it was during antiquity and is today. Except for the wealthy, people did sweep their floors, carry their goods and produce, work in the garden, move from the time they woke until they rested, and they danced. As Mercuriali himself points out in a chapter titled The Purpose and Place of Dancing, human beings have always danced, if not for exercise per se, then for its social aspects and for the pure pleasure to be found in rhythmically moving one's body. A near contemporary of Mercuriali's, the Venetian physiologist and physician known as Santorio, agreed, albeit with a note of caution. Moderate dancing without jumping comes the nearest of anything, he said, to the advantages of walking, for it leisurely expels the digested perspirable matter. Alice made a connection to the philosophy of another Italian physician and teacher, Maria Montessori. In Montessori, they teach that there is work and there is play, and both are important. But the way it is now, exercise is in this category of work, and that's not where it should be, as if one has to work for good health. No, good health shouldn't be the goal of exercise. Make pleasure the goal, as in dancing, and it will lead to good health, she said. I was intrigued and stimulated by Alice's views. Giving up the gym, slowing down, not speeding up, going outside, just getting the body moving, whatever the weather, not staying in, and dancing more. A slow burn, not a competitive one. It seemed to me the epitome of going local, local being your own body, viewing one's body as the ultimate sustainable resource.
I think that makes exercise sound a lot more attractive to some people. And you talk about it like that, right?
Yeah.
'Cause a lot of people resist exercise because it feels like work and it's a struggle. But if you think about it as play with pleasure as the goal, I mean, I think to me, it seems like the highest form of it where you have the pleasure of being at home in your body.
Yeah.
And I wonder what are your thoughts on that? Sort of across, I guess, certainly in the book, you have different moods and feelings about exercise and different forms of it, like you said, over the course of your life and in your different practices. And so I wonder if you have a kind of 30,000-foot view of the exercise that feels like this wonderful sustainable resource and the exercise that feels like getting punched in the face, which clearly, boxing maybe was like.
I do. I mean, I suppose because I wrote this book, people ask me about how do you get motivated to exercise? Because you're right. A lot of people associate it with no fun.
Like every day, it feels like getting punched in the face.
And it was fascinating to do the research and learn that back in antiquity, 4th, 5th century BC, they really had a lot of things right about exercise, about incorporating exercise into your daily life, about exercising in moderation, not overdoing it, and for it to be something that is also, as Galen said, something that delights the soul. But it was fascinating as well to learn that indisputable scientific evidence for the benefits of exercise didn't come until relatively recently. It was in the mid-1950s that there was real scientific studies done proving that exercise extended lifespan, prevented illness, and so forth. Anyway, I tell people, despite that, don't exercise because you think it will make you live longer. Exercise for how it makes you feel now, in your body, about your life, in your life, and keep trying different forms of exercise. There are lots of different ways to move, and maybe the gym is not your thing. Maybe swimming is not your thing. You can dance in your apartment for 15 minutes, and that is exercise. Or if you're having trouble finding the time or motivation, get off when you're coming home from work, get off 2 bus stops early or 2 subway stops early and walk the rest of the way home. And then you can tell yourself you exercised. One of the things I love about Mercuriali's book from the 16th century is that he defines exercise as vigorous physical movement that gets you breathing. But one of his criteria is intention. You have to have the aim of exercising for your health or for your constitution. And this is what separates exercise from other forms of movement. So if you're rowing a boat simply to get across the lake, you're really just rowing for transportation. But if you're rowing for the pleasure of being out on the water and using your upper body and that enjoying that rhythmic movement of rowing a boat, just with that different intention or mindset, you're exercising.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an interesting point you make, because it's like, it's almost that it's a philosophical distinction or a mindfulness distinction of focusing on the motions that may not be different, the movements that may not be different from some other set of movements in your life,
right?
But that these are it's an opportunity not just to, as you said, as to burn calories or strengthen your biceps, but to I mean, this sounds lofty, but I think this is the point, is that there's like some kind of some other thing that is benefiting you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as we both said, it can be any form of movement, and it's the intention that comes along with it. Yeah. I mean, when I swim, sometimes I really dread making the walk to the swimming pool. It's about a 20-minute walk and it's cold out, and maybe I don't exactly feel like doing it. But once I'm in the water and practicing and thinking about my technique and letting all my other cares go away, but more importantly, once I get out of the pool and realize, wow, I just swam a mile. it changes your day.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you such a sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you know that. You should be talking about swimming. You're a master, and your book is so wonderful, Why We Swim.
Thank you. I do. I mean, I think that the, swimming particularly has that, leaves you with the buoyancy, leaves you with, you work really hard in the water doesn't mean that I think just because you have that feeling that you're being supported in the water doesn't mean that you don't work hard in it, but that there is an element of pleasure because you're in the water, I think, that makes it, I think, more enjoyable for many people. And so I think on a larger sense, the exercise that you find for yourself that brings you that pleasure, I mean, that's your exercise.
Yeah.
That if you find that thing that you really look forward to doing because it feels good to you the way something else doesn't, I think that's how you know. And I think that that's one of the great pleasures in life. I mean, to me, really, like, I just love that sense of cruising through the water, whether it's swimming or when I'm paddling, surfing and going and sprinting to catch the wave. Like there is the lightness, there is the attention to the moment that I think is really wonderful for myself from a physical perspective, but also from a it clears my mind. And I think that is one of the great benefits of exercise.
Yeah. And just pausing to appreciate that we can do this, that we have the health, we have the ability, or even if we have limited abilities to move in some way. Yeah, we were talking about walking and how that came to be more important and something I really appreciated, especially during the lockdown, during the pandemic. To take a walk felt like a great pleasure.
Yeah, I think that it was the one time we all took to get out of the house.
Yeah.
So before we move on to take audience questions, I wanted to touch on, back on return back to the idea of taking a break, that pause.
Oh, yeah.
Even you, as a lifelong devotee of exercise, you took a very long break from it.
I did, yes.
Yeah. So I think that there are reasons that you do touch on in the book. And you write very movingly in the book that it started not long after your partner Oliver Sacks died in 2015.
Right.
And you said that all went silent, life became very quiet, and my interest in exercise went silent too. And years went by, and you write that the gym or the pool or the yoga class seemed like increasingly far off destinations. And I think that, for all our proselytizing about exercise, I do think that this moment to me really was important. I wanted to spotlight it because I think that a lot of people are have been going through in these last 2 years, this sense of like detachment or that the things that did bring them pleasure don't anymore, or that they feel somehow, through this scrim. And I guess I thought it would be really lovely to hear you talk a little bit about how that unfolded for you and what brought you back to exercise.
Yeah, I think it's good to talk about because some people feel guilty if they aren't practicing an exercise regimen, or guilty because they haven't been to the gym in a couple months or whatever. I'm really an advocate for rest, the importance of rest. Your body does need rest. You don't want to injure yourself. And for taking a break. I mean, if you are not enjoying it, we talked about do it for how it makes you feel now in your body, about your life. If you're not enjoying it, maybe you need to take a break, and that's okay. You may come back even stronger than before. But for me personally, swimming was something that Oliver and I loved to do together. And we swam at Chelsea Piers, swam laps, but also swam in that cold mountain lake and all over the world, when we traveled. And both worked out at the gym. We wouldn't necessarily go together, but sometimes I'd bump into him at the gym, and that was always kind of a delight. And I think even lifting was something I did in a certain way for my partner, to look good, to look buff, to feel good. And when he died, that interest in exercise went silent or sort of died too for a while. It was certainly grief, moving through grief and not finding relief from that in swimming like one might think I would, but instead I just associated the pool and swimming so much with him, and I missed him so much. It just was something I wanted to avoid. And so there was definitely grief and depression for sure. And I did get some help. But what sort of really brought me back to exercise was a wake-up call from my doctor. I was in my 50s and was diagnosed with high blood pressure. And high blood pressure runs in my family. I wasn't too surprised, but he prescribed a blood pressure med, but also said, you've got to up your cardio, And so he kind of gave me that wake-up call, and that got me back to the pool. It had been, about 3 years. I didn't swim for about 3 years, and slowly made my way back into it, and to lifting, and to doing things at home, like push-ups. I got a chin-up bar. And, by that time I'd sort of moved through a very dark period of grief and depression, and I was really ready to embrace life and appreciate what I can do. That opening of the book where I plunge into the cold lake and I describe it in very vivid detail, and then, scamper back onto the dock, grab a towel, and there's someone on the dock who says, like, what the hell are you doing? Why would you do that? The water is so freezing. And I answer simply, because I can. And by that, I mean, because I'm alive and I'm healthy and I can experience that. And yes, it was damn cold, but it made me feel even more alive.
Right.
And so while we can, we should do it or try these things.
I think that's a really wonderful place to pause and kind of it's because it's the idea it's a way to encourage people now at this time, when sort of beginning the year, we're all thinking about what we want this year to look like, and and to just say, like, oh, this can be for me because it makes me feel more alive. It reminds me what it is to be that. And
and maybe in the past you were a total gym rat, but I'm sure they have city bikes and things like that in San Francisco, just like in New York. Maybe if you've never bicycled, try bicycling. It's a great exercise, and it's also an important moment in the history of exercise when the bicycle was invented. So that's another great form of exercise. Anyway, don't get me started on that.
Historical, literary nerd comes out.
Yeah, don't let me go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I wanted to hop into the questions.
Okay.
So if you have any questions, people who are here with us, I'm going to run through some of these lovely comments and questions here that we have already in the chat. Christopher Walling says, has one of you seen the minuscule, colorful house on a tiny street in which Kafka lived in the citadel of Prague? The neighbor, if it was there, had inches to go to knock on Kafka's door. Oh, that's good. Just practically was living with him.
That's funny. No, I have not. I'm glad to know that detail.
That's so great. Nancy asks, what type of exercise did you not try and wish you had or still may? That's a great question.
That is a really good question. Let's see, throw some at me. I never did Pilates. Never done that.
Did you soul cycle? I'm trying to think of all the fads.
Actually, I really didn't. I mean, I guess I did some spin classes early on. But no, I never did the actual soul cycle, or what's the other one that's big?
Peloton?
Something about, I mean, I went through a period of doing group fitness.
Yeah.
But there's something about being sort of yelled at by a drill master telling you what to do, that it's just not my thing. So I guess I'm more the yoga class type, or more the individual exerciser.
Now I'm trying to picture back in, ancient Greece, someone just yelling at a bunch of guys in the sauna. I don't know. So like, do some lifts, do some like, bicep curls. Yeah, it doesn't work. Doesn't seem to be right.
I ran when I was younger, but I don't do much running anymore at all. Yeah.
Like we said, the grinding
Yeah.
joints. My knees can't take it anymore. We're showing our age. All right. Shona says, or she asks, what's to be said about sweating it out in a sauna? For example, jockeys and those who see having a sauna as an easy form of exercise.
Yeah, a lot of misconceptions about sweating and perspiration. And it was interesting to learn about the actual physiology of sweating. I think there's a real misconception that you go into a sauna to sweat out the toxins, quote unquote, or exercise, go for a run to sweat out the toxins or the alcohol you've drunk the night before. The fact is there are other organs in the body that really do take care of that, namely the liver and the kidneys are there to filter out toxins and other waste in the body. The primary function of sweat and sweating, perspiration, is thermoregulation. Your body gets overheated, and there's this amazing, simple system where a fluid is excreted through the pores, and then the air cools you down, cools the water down. So it's really about thermoregulation. It's about cooling you down. It was an evolutionary adaptation that came as we evolved into walking, running creatures, running under the hot sun.
Lucky for us.
Yes.
Robert Berry asks, one of the many effects I get from exercise is the mood altering or antidepressant effect, I think. Is this common?
I think that's very common and certainly recommended for those who are in depression. And there are certainly neurochemicals that are generated when you exercise, like endorphins, that are good for your brain and good for your mood. It's certainly something that I incorporate into my life for that exact reason. So I think it's absolutely true. And a shout out to Robert. Hi, Robert. And all my San Francisco friends.
Janine asks, in your research, did you notice any aspect of community building resulting from exercise, or does it tend to be more personal?
That's such a great question. When I really noticed the community building aspect of exercise, or the social aspect of exercise?
Where?
During the pandemic.
Oh, yes.
Because those of us used to go into gyms, which can be sort of community or social centers. Suddenly we're without them and sort of isolated in our homes and apartments. What I noticed here in New York, I'm sure you noticed it in San Francisco or Seattle, was people sort of spontaneously coming together in parks and other public spaces to exercise. Sometimes spontaneous kind of group fitness classes, sometimes organized by a teacher or a boxing coach or a yoga teacher. But often what I saw at the piers when I would take my walks is that people would just gather to do exercise on their own, but they wanted to be around other human beings.
Right.
And I thought that was so fascinating. So they weren't part of a group class, but they wanted to be around other human beings and exercise. And one thing I say is the gym is one place where copying is never cheating, And I think part of it is you watch other people who are really skilled, whether at yoga or sparring, boxing, or running. I think it's really smart to watch other people and try to learn from how they move. And I think that's part of what was happening, but also just a desire to connect with other human beings that came out during the pandemic. And in the out of doors, in the fresh air,
Mhm.
which was also a very 19th century kind of
Right.
movement.
Yeah, I mean, taking the sea air, if you were lucky enough to be by the seaside. I mean,
Right.
also, you make me think of also this, the phenomenon, the sort of psychological, when you're moving in synchrony with others, there's this feeling of, there's the social reinforcement of that feels really good too. Like if you were in a dance class, or maybe you were doing Tai Chi, in a group, that was that's something that certainly probably had even more power in the pandemic when we were so isolated otherwise. I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's also, I write a chapter in the book about the AIDS pandemic, which I lived through in San Francisco in the 80s and 90s, and the importance of the gym, especially for gay men, as a place almost like a community center, to connect, to share information, but also to get fit and to sort of try to fight off that particular virus. So there's a real connection between exercise and community, for sure.
Christopher Walling says, I use a standing punching bag to do anger work. It's a terrific vehicle for that.
That's excellent.
Yes, that's a really good observation and suggestion for anyone who feels that can be helpful. It's a very healthy way to deal with your.
Absolutely. So there's that.
And then there's a few other lovely comments. Shona says, swimming is a great way to meditate. I find it's impossible for me to meditate per se. There's something about the water that's so calming.
Yeah.
And Dan Maeda just wanted to give you props for reading that first passage, which I thought was beautiful.
Thank you, Dan.
Nancy, I think, she was asking if tennis was something that you tried or didn't try, or.
Oh, yeah, I played tennis as a kid. There was a park just down the street with tennis courts, but I never did it competitively, and I haven't kept it up. It's interesting, in the book, I talk about the distinction between exercise and sports, or exercise and athletics. And it goes back to that whole question of intention. What is your intention? And with sports and athletics, of course, there are usually rules to the game. There's an opponent, whether that's an individual like playing tennis, or a team opponent like football or baseball or whatever. And there's a winner and there's a loser. And with exercise, you're always a winner. You're always a winner. Always a winner. And you can make up your own rules. There's no perfect swimming stroke, is there, Bonnie? I mean, I bet you have the most beautiful stroke, but you're always perfecting it, right? And yeah.
I think that's a really lovely distinction to make, because I think thinking about it as something for yourself and not about winning or losing, or about other people, or about competing. Right. And that also takes away some of maybe the threat or scariness about exercise that some people really do resist. And I think a lot of people don't like competition, and right. So they resist the movement aspect because they associate all of that with like the social stuff that they don't really, that doesn't bring them joy. And I think that's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Dan has a question. In starting your research, how did you not get overwhelmed with the amount of investigation and detective work you had to undertake?
Well,
please enlighten us.
Guess what? I definitely did. I mean, that was part of the reason I set the book aside. I did a huge amount of research, and then I had to sit down and write the book. And Bonnie and I were talking about this before this event started, how as writers, we do sometimes hit periods where you just get overwhelmed. In my case, it was so much research, I didn't know how to structure it as a narrative that would be entertaining. I wanted it to be entertaining, this book, not just dry history. Or sometimes you just can't find the shape, you can't find the rhythm, you lose your confidence. you lose your inspiration. Sometimes you work on books too long. We were talking about how sometimes they come really fast, and how fun that can be. But yeah, in this case, I definitely got overwhelmed and didn't know how to structure it. But I think that's when, you know, weaving in Mercuriali's story, weaving in my own history of exercise made it a little more fun to write. And I was able to draw upon these different bits of research I had done.
I think when it starts to feel fun is when you know that it's going well, you know?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, didn't you say that when you came up with your title, Why We Swim, suddenly it was like
all
the
kind
piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a title can do that. Yeah.
It's magical. I know we all are seeking that magic, I think, with different stages of the writing. I think
We probably have to wrap up soon.
we hit 8 o'clock on the dot. How perfect is this? Thank you so much, Bill, for this wonderful, fun conversation. I could talk to you for many, many more hours, but I think we're not allowed to.
Me too.
Thank you to our audience for being here to celebrate Bill's new book, Sweat, A History of Exercise. And thank you to Green Apple for hosting us all tonight. I encourage you in this well-exercised glow of our discussion with Bill tonight to purchase books from Green Apple immediately. Don't wait, run. And thank you, for being the literary heartbeat of what we do. All of our independent bookstores really are that. So I thank you very much.
And I want to thank you, Bonnie. You've been an amazing host and so fun to have this conversation with you. I'd love to swim with you someday.
Yes, let's do it. When you get to San Francisco or I get to New York, we're gonna do it.
See you at Chelsea Piers. Or in the open water.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Please come grab your signed copies of Sweat before we run out. And we have plenty of Bonnie's book as well.
Yay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Keep sweating, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Bonnie.